Nika thought if she stayed in the warm, soggy bog much longer, her skin would wrinkle up like her fingers did when she stayed in the bath too long. Randall and Ian had already gotten up. She finally crawled out and searched the tent for something to wear that wasn't wet. After shimmying into clammy jeans that stuck to her skin and an almost dry t shirt, she headed back to the wonderful wooden box with a hole in it that took the place of an outhouse. When she came back, she announced, "I have a new name for the Biffy. Not the outhouse, but the outbox." Randall laughed. Ian said with mock seriousness, "From now on, the outbox it is." She plunked oatmeal into her plastic bowl, adorned it with dried cranberries and brown sugar, and sat on a log beside Randall. When she looked sideways at her brother, he was smiling at her, with that irresistible grin he had. She punched him in the arm and smiled back. Ian seemed upbeat this morning, too. Nika hoped that meant talk about Khan was history. "After we get the dishes done and put the wet bags and clothes out to dry in the sun, I want to show you guys something." He scraped the last bite of oatmeal from his bowl and licked the spoon. Then he pulled the hot water pot from the fire and gave it a squirt of dish soap. It took just a few minutes for the three of them to get the dishes washed and upside down on rocks to dry. Their campsite was on a sheet of granite as big as 2 backyards, extending from the fire grate down to the lake. Soon, socks were lined up, jeans draped over bushes, and the sleeping bags laid open on rocks in the sun. Better than a clothesline. Ian glanced at the neat rows of wet things. Next, he pulled several aluminum pots and cups from the food pack and started up a path toward a hill flanked by a wall of trees. Over his shoulder, he asked, "Ready?" Randall scampered after him. Ian didn't even wait to see if Nika would come, but crashed back through the trees out of sight. When Zeus circled back to jump on her and whine, Nika decided to follow. The path became steep past the first trees. They climbed higher and higher until they were on a ridge where they could see down the blue distance to faraway shores of the lake. She smelled that sweet herbal smell again, the one she'd smelled on the Big Island. Ian bent down, grinned, and pointed. He picked a handful for both of them to see. Blueberries, small ones. These were like the green berries that she had seen on Big Island, except they were blue. A whole hillside of blue. Nika put one in her mouth. The taste was sharp and sweet, better than the fat, puffy blueberries from the store. Ian laughed as he watched her face. The three of them went to work. For a long time there was no sound except the drumming of blueberries excuse me, on the bottom of the aluminum pots. "Wow," said Randall, looking at an inch of blueberries at the bottom of his pot. "Look over here, Randall. These are big ones," Ian exclaimed. Nika moved to a new patch of little bushes heavy with berries, eating most of what she picked. Ian looked her way as she stuffed another handful in her mouth, as though she were unwrapping a gift he'd given her. He smiled, then returned to picking. She was blown away that the blueberries just grew here. Nobody planted them. Maybe they had been growing here for 1,000 years or more. Eagerly, she began filling her own pot. For the next 2 days, they stuffed themselves with blueberries, putting them in pancakes and oatmeal, or just eating them by the handful. Randall's favorite was blueberries and hot pudding after dinner. Ian had brought a special hard plastic box to protect the berries in the pack so that they could bring some back to Pearl. Even though the wolves and Thomas were never far from Nika's mind, she began to enjoy the adventure. Ian took them to explore Serpent Lake by canoe, poking into sand beaches for a swim, looking for the deepest spots of rock ledges to fish. She toughened up, not much minding that she had swellings and welts from various insects, or that her skin was peeling and tanned from the hours in the sun. Except for the flood that first night, the weather stayed clear the whole time. They swam off the rocks at their campsite whenever they felt like it. She even caught 2 fish. Ian sang silly songs around the campfire and taught them the words. He showed them how to cook pancakes and noodle mixed dinners over the fire. Randall caught a northern pike almost as long as Ian's leg. Ian took at least 60 pictures before they let it go. The last night on Serpent Lake, they built up the campfire and sat together watching the setting sun flare through the folds of clouds, changing layers to peach and pink and purple. Close to them on the lake, they had heard the familiar hunting haunting two-tone call hung above the surface of the darkening water. Then came the two-tone answer. It didn't matter how many times Nika heard loons. The mysterious music always thrilled her. They sounded like Native American flutes she'd heard at the farmer's market, or oboes in school orchestra. Another call came from a different direction. Soon 8 or 10 loons flew down one by one to land on the water. The night was so quiet they could hear each splash as the birds joined the group. The loons drifted together as the plate-sized moon rose up behind the black outline of trees on the other side of the lake. It's almost like one of the loons called a meeting, Randall said. It's pretty cool to camp like this for a week or longer to really get into the rhythm, Ian said, making 2 trips to bring cups, packets of cocoa, and a pot of hot water over to where they sat. Next time we'll go for longer. Next time? Nika thought. What did he mean? He didn't say anything more. Nika decided the main question she wanted to ask couldn't wait any longer. Well, I know we'll be going home soon, so I'll just ask. I mean, why didn't we ever know you before? She looked at Randall. He sat up straighter and glanced at her with a worried expression. Ian paused and then spoke. I know I mentioned in my letter that your dad and I weren't very close. I went off to college when he was still a little boy, and then to jobs overseas. Both Randall and Nika sat very still. Also, I guess I was the kind of guy who loved his work so much, I let other stuff go. I saw you, Nika, as a baby, and then after getting my degree in wildlife biology. I took off, going from job to job and school to school. You probably can't understand this, but years go by like that. It was Kate and Sean's fault too. We all just gave up trying to communicate. I heard through friends that Randall was born, and then that Sean lost his job and joined the military. Then we lost him in that munitions accident overseas. Randall scooted closer to Nika on the rock. After his funeral, I left calls for your mom. She never called back. Then she moved your family to California. I figured she would remarry. I ended up studying wolves in the remote forests of Finland and Russia and was completely out of touch for a few years. When I finally came back, I wondered about you kids, so I sent a Christmas card, and it came back. I imagined Kate had moved on, and that was what she wanted. Several moments passed, and then that letter came from Miss Nordstrom. If he ran off to Russia once, what would stop him from disappearing again? Nika wondered. Maybe there were wolves in Ethiopia or Tibet that needed studying. Then Ian cleared his throat and looked at her. I've told Randall about the job in Red Pine. Hearing a single splash, Nika looked out over the dark water. A fish, perhaps, or a frog. And Ian says I can help out at the center, said Randall, tapping her arm. We can stay all summer, Neeks. Awesome, huh? 2 loons now started up a back-and-forth conversation farther down the lake. They sounded lonely, as if they were calling at the beginning of the world. A 3rd loon made its wild, hysterical laugh. Ian rose to his feet and began putting food and gear away for the night. Hey, Randall, would you? But before Ian got the words out, Randall grinned, grabbed a bucket, and hopped down to the lake in the thin light, as agile as a mountain goat. He spilled half the water coming back, but still had plenty to put out the fire. It must have been 3 in the morning when Nika got up to go to the outbox. Zeus dutifully shook himself and joined her. In the pressing dark, the tangy, damp air, and the tiptoe stillness, she was grateful for his company. Following the path back from the outbox, the narrow cone of light from her flashlight darted through the trees. Reaching the tent, she stopped to listen to the rat-a-tat-tat of a loon wings hitting the water at takeoff. Ian had told her about how they have a hard time getting airborne because they're heavy in the front for diving, and their bones aren't hollow like other birds. Over by the fireplace rocks, she was surprised to see the black outline of Ian, the sky behind him impossibly bright. Why don't you get Randall and come out here? He asked quietly. She stood by the tent for a minute, wanting to crawl back into her bag. Then curiosity pulled at her, and she wiggled through the tent door to shake Randall's foot. Ian says come, she said, shaking him again. Like a sleepwalker, Randall rose, staggered outside, and fell into line behind the waving beam of her flashlight. When they followed Ian by the fire grate, he put his hands on her shoulders and slowly guided them forward over the smooth rock toward the lake. It was funny, but she felt different now that she knew why he'd been gone from their lives. It hadn't been all his fault. Now look up, he said. Nika couldn't understand what she was seeing. Randall rubbed his eyes. The sky was flowing with shivering scarves of pastel-colored light. Greens, pinks, pale yellow. There were ribbons unfolding, a swelling glimmer as the horizon pulsed and faded. There were skittering falls of light. They sat down on the still warm rock. Northern lights, Ian said. The aurora borealis. The light oozed and shuddered, a show just for the three of them. Each time one section of the northern sky faded, another tumbled with new light shapes. Wow, Randall whispered. It was like being in church, Nika thought, or at an art museum. You whispered because voices would disturb the beauty. Always the science guy, Ian explained. It's caused by energy that streams with charged particles coming from the sun. They flow through twisted bundles of magnetic fields connecting with the upper atmosphere. Like sunstorms, kind of, he said. Wow, Randall said again. Nika thought Ian sounded like her science teacher last year. Silently, she watched for each new blossoming wave of light. But it doesn't much matter what causes them, does it? They're incredible, Ian concluded in the pin-drop quiet. Nika hadn't wanted to come on this camping trip, but now, after the northern lights, the blueberries, the paddling on the clean water, the wing beats at sunset, her heart felt new and fresh. The sky was singing, and she loved the song, and she didn't pull away when Ian looped arms around both of them and hugged them closer. She huddled into his warmth, shivering. Finally, he helped them to their feet and guided them back to the tent. In the morning, after packing her personal things, Nika slipped away to be by herself for a few minutes. Randall was squeezing in the last bout of fishing, and Ian was beating up the pancake batter. She picked her way down to the rock to a perfect flat spot and noticed again the smooth grooves carved in the rock face, like giant claw marks. She touched the grooves, then rolled back until she was flat against the cool embrace of the rock. Yesterday, Ian had told them that the grooves in this rock had been made by glaciers 10,000 years ago, almost 800 times her life so far. As she lay back with her eyes closed, she wondered if there had been wolves here back then. Ian really dazzled them when he said the rock itself was 2.7 billion years old. Billion, with a B. She felt like a moth or an otter on this ancient rock and wondered how humans had got to thinking they were so important with their bad TV and endless malls, when this rock had been here almost since the beginning of time. Ian had been saying that wild places are important because there's no other way to know completely about how deep nature is except to lie on a rock like this, listen to the water slapping the shore, watch dragonflies patrolling, and to smell deep down what the earth has always been. Now she understood. Just then Ian called, "Breakfast, come and get it." She didn't know what it was, but something felt different this morning. She climbed back up the rock and joined Ian and Randall in the front of the snapping fire. Ian held out a plate of pancakes covered with maple syrup and blueberries. She took the steaming plate, looked at Ian, and smiled. "Thanks, Uncle Ian." For a minute he looked surprised. Then he answered, "You're very welcome, niece Nika," and handed her a camping fork. One morning the silvery tan wolf heard a boat pass slowly by. There was no metal sound. When the two humans came that afternoon, the light-colored wolf stayed deep in the trees. After they left, there was meat unlike anything the wolf had eaten since being with the woman. There were large slabs of the best meat, ripe wild meat with the taste of the forest. First chasing the eagles away, she ate until her belly bulged. When she couldn't eat any more, she took scraps off to the center of the island, where she cached them for another day, using her nose to cover them with dirt and moss. And that is the end of chapter 15.